Hey guys, it's Justine here from I Should Read That, and today I'm going to bring you a book review of Legendary by Stephanie Garber. So just to get this disclaimer out of the way, I read an early copy of this book via NetGalley, and I was provided this book by the publisher, but it doesn't affect my opinion on it whatsoever. This video will be spoiler-free for Legendary, however there will be major spoilers for Caraval, so if you haven't read the first book and you would like to, I highly suggest turning this video off. So if you are not in the know, Legendary is actually the sequel to Caraval by Stephanie Garber, which came out last year. It is the second book in this trilogy. We just found out that it was going to become a trilogy a few weeks ago, actually, when she announced that there was going to be one final book in this series. I had kind of a funny reaction to Caraval when I read it last year. It was at the very beginning of my kind of introduction to the book community online. It was right when I had started my blog, and I was so excited about everything, and I was getting completely caught up in the hype and being swept away by all of these amazing books I'd never heard of but now had access to. I wouldn't have heard about Caraval, I don't think, if it weren't for the book community, so I was seeing all these amazing things about it, how it was so like twisty, turny, and magical, and this incredible book, and I actually ended up being slightly disappointed by it. I even listed it as one of my most disappointing books of 2017, which I did a video for. I can link that below for you if you would like to see it. But I fully acknowledge that out of all of those books that I listed on that video, it was probably the one that I would go back and read again now that the hype has died down for it. Knowing exactly what happened to me with Caraval, I decided to get my paws on a copy of Legendary as early as possible, read it as early as possible so that I could kind of skip over all that hype and really get my own opinion on it. Comparing the two books, I think that Legendary did some things much better than Caraval, and in a lot of other ways Caraval was the better book, so I'm going to dive into it now. Legendary picks up exactly pretty much where Caraval leaves off. In fact, it's the next morning. Instead of following Scarlet, as we do in the first book, now we're following Tella, who's the younger of the two sisters. At this point, we know that Tella is sort of the one who orchestrated everything that happened in the first book, and at the very end of that first book, we find out that she has done something, and we don't quite know what it is, but she finds a note in her pocket and does not have good feelings about it. This sets off a sort of chain of events that leads Tella to playing Caraval herself. One of the ways that I think Legendary was a stronger book than Caraval is the fact that we get world building in this book, which is something that I feel I didn't really notice in Caraval, but I think it did affect what I thought of the book in the end. In Legendary, we get to see the world outside of the game of Caraval. We get to see the world outside of the sisters' island that they live on. There's a whole empire out there, and we get to go to the Imperial City. We get to learn a little bit about the Empress, and we also get to learn a little bit about the mythology of this land, which I won't say too much about this because it's something that you should really unravel on your own, but I really liked the way the fates were included in the world. I liked all of the sort of mythology that surrounded them. I thought it was really interesting. Something I think is going to be another strong point for a lot of readers is that Tella, of course, is the character that we're following rather than Scarlet. I think that I'm in the minority when I say that I actually really liked Scarlet as a character. She's very docile and very meek when she starts, but she has this amazing character arc, and she's a very different person by the time Caraval ends. The one thing that I have to say about Tella is that if you like her in the beginning, that's a great thing, because she is the exact same person at the end. She doesn't have that same personal growth, and I thought that was really a shame. She is, of course, the sister with lots of fire and spark, and she kind of like just storms into a room and sees what happens. She's a really interesting character in that sense, but after a while I felt like it was a little one note, and I wanted something a little bit different from her. In terms of plot, I felt like it was a little bit of a cop-out, in the way that Catching Fire in the Hunger Games trilogy was a little bit of a cop-out, because as we see in Catching Fire, hopefully no spoilers here because I feel like everyone's read these books, we go back into the Hunger Games. It's the exact same thing here. We go back into Caraval. And I don't know, I think that part of what made Caraval the book interesting is that we didn't know what was happening. We didn't know who to trust. We didn't know where these twists and turns were coming from. The magic was all there. What was real? What wasn't real? We know all of this now. We don't have that sense of discovery that you do in the first book. Half the fun is trying to figure out what the hell is going on in Caraval, and I don't know, I don't think that we really needed to figure out what the hell was going on in Legendary because we all kind of knew what to expect. There are some bits that she sort of added on to the story that we don't get in Caraval, because in Caraval, Scarlet is just completely engrossed in this game the entire time she is in the game. In Legendary, that's not necessarily the case, and I think that adding some of those outside elements was good and bad in a way, because on the one hand, you get a little bit of a break, and you get to sort of let Tella run around and do her crazy thing, but at the same time, I think that the game is what makes this book interesting. That's what we're here for, and I think that it was sort of a weird balancing act. If you didn't like Stephanie Garber's writing style in the first book, you're not going to like it in the second one. That doesn't change, and I do think it's a weakness of hers, because that writing style, for me, just doesn't really work. There are actually a couple of lines that I wrote down that I thought just didn't really work for me. One of them, she's talking about like sort of this big iron cage, and she says the bars smelled of iron and royal ambition, which makes no sense at all. And then she mentions a character smells of ink and heartbreak. And I feel like these are lines that are supposed to like sound really nice and like sound really cool, like Laini Taylor's writing, for example, but for me, she just doesn't really pull it off. In terms of characters, I like Tella well enough. I think that she's a very kind of standard YA heroine. She's someone we've seen before, and that's fine, that's great. There's a reason that these kinds of characters are popular. It would have been nice to see someone a little bit different. It would have been nice to see someone more like Scarlet, as I keep harping on about, because I felt like that just added a more interesting element to the story. I was really engrossed in what was happening to Scarlet. I was less so with what was happening to Tella. There's a romance in this book as well, and I have to say it was one of the most lackluster romances that I've read in a while. I won't say much about it, and I know that people will very much disagree with me on this, but I don't think that it's a quasi-love triangle, and I don't think that the sort of characters were all that interesting to me. One in particular, one is more interesting just in terms of like who he is. I won't get into any of this now. We can talk about this if you've read the book. But I thought that romance, funny enough, is not one of Stephanie Garber's strong points. I don't think that she, for me, writes very interesting and compelling romances. One thing that I did really enjoy about this is that we do get to go back to Scarlet, and we do get to see the fallout of the first book. She goes through this huge emotional trauma, this kind of like awakening of herself and becoming more confident and kind of shaking off the years of abuse at her father's hands. And I thought that that was a really interesting thing to include, because usually, you know, the book ends and we're just left to assume that they live happily ever after. That's not necessarily the case here, because Scarlet is still traumatized, rightfully, by what happened during Caraval. She still doesn't know who to trust. She still doesn't know who's acting and who's not. I thought that it was a really, really interesting thing to include in this book. As Scarlet is not a huge character, but definitely an important minor character, I was a little bit disappointed that we don't see more interaction between the sisters. We're always told how close they are in the first and in the second book, but they hardly ever interact with each other. I mean, Tella is fake kidnapped in the first book, so she's not even in it for most of it. And in this one, Tella's really on her own. She doesn't have Scarlet's help and doesn't have Scarlet's assistance. This is something that I think is going to be fixed in the finale, because it is told from both sisters' point of views. Overall, I thought Legendary was actually pretty lackluster. And there were things that I liked and things that I didn't like about this book. There were things I thought were much better in the first, things I thought were better in this one, but overall, I found it kind of disappointing. I ended up giving this 2.75 out of 5 stars. I realize it's a very, very specific rating, but I didn't think it quite merited that 3-star rating, but it wasn't really a 2 for me. It was entertaining, and it was a really fast read. I powered through this book in like 2 days just on like bus journeys. And while it was fun and entertaining, it just, I think, is quite forgettable. I think that the world she created in the first one really worked as a standalone, or maybe if she was going to expand it beyond Caraval and not do the kind of Hunger Games thing and did something completely different, then maybe it would stand up as a better book. But for me, the magic was gone, really. So let me know in the comments if you've read Caraval, what you thought of it. If you've read Legendary already, I would really love to hear what you think. I post bookish videos to this channel fairly frequently, so if you enjoyed this, then definitely hit subscribe, and I will see you next time.